Hello and welcome back to Serial Killers. Today we'll be beginning Volume 3. Of course, I am your narrator, Porter Hymus, and, well, let's show you what you're going to be getting with this volume. Again, as a warning, this PowerPoint contains disturbing and often graphic descriptions and images of murder, assault, sexual content, and some vile language, and viewer discretion is advised. So, Volume 3 includes the biographies on serial killer Jane Toppan, Nanny Doss, and Dennis Rader. Of course, for more content and updates on this channel and the PowerPoints, you can follow Instagram at serialkillers0011 with 2 underscores. Alright, Jane Toppan, also known as Jolly Jane, had a victim count of 31 plus. This is another case that takes place in the late 1800s, early 1900s, so again, records and police investigations is kind of skewed, and the full extent of the crimes is not quite known. Also, I just wanted to mention the intro for the biographies there. Since we're in Volume 3, you should probably know that that is inspired by the TV series Fargo on FX, if you're just curious. Alright, Jane Toppan was born Honora Kelly to Peter and Bridget Kelly in Boston, Massachusetts in 1857, with the Industrial Revolution growing textile factories around the Boston area. Peter and Bridget Kelly were Irish immigrants who came to Massachusetts to find a better life, like most Irish immigrants at the time, but also, like immigrants who were Irish at the time, faced discrimination, especially for their Catholic beliefs. The young couple struggled to support the family of 3 children, Nellie, Delia Josephine, and, of course, Honora Kelly. Bridget Kelly died of consumption or tuberculosis soon after Honora was born, as TB was the leading cause of death at the time. Peter Kelly was heartbroken and turned to alcohol in order to cope. However, he became aggressive, violent, he would often get into fights, lose his job, and it is also believed that Kelly abused his daughters, as witnesses say they saw the girls with bruises. Peter Kelly realized he couldn't support his daughters and sent 6-year-old Honora and 8-year-old Delia Josephine to the Boston Female Asylum in February of 1963. It was the last time the two ever saw their father. The Boston Female Asylum was founded in 1799 by a Mrs. Hannah Stillman, who intended the facility to be a care facility for wayward and mentally ill girls, but slowly it pretty much became an orphanage for girls. Because of poor records at the time, it is unclear about what happened to Peter Kelly, but rumors say that Peter Kelly continued to drink and slowly go mad, and was even given the nickname Kelly the Crack being short for crackpot. It is rumored that Peter Kelly got a job as a local tailor at a tailor shop and was found trying to sew his eyes shut. Meanwhile, at the Boston Female Asylum, the girls spent the next year or so there, And while there are no personal records or accounts of Honora's time at the asylum, it is note that the asylum teach basic skills of math, reading and writing, and domestic skills such as cooking, cleaning, sewing, etc., or traditional work women did in the late 1800s. The asylum girls were usually held until the age of 10 years old and then turned over to foster homes as indentured servants to live and work until the girls turned 18. Then they were given $50 as sort of a stipend and sent out to live on their own. Of course, as a friendly note, $50 is a lot more in the 1800s than it is now. When Honora Kelly turned 10 years old, she went to live with a woman named Anne C. Toppan, along with another girl named Elizabeth in Lower Massachusetts. Honora would never see her sister ever again, and again, by lack of records, it is unsure what happened to the other two sisters. It is said that Delia Josephine stayed in the asylum until 1869 and then was sent to Athol, New York at the age of 12. She later turned to a life of drinking and prostitution and died living in destitution, which, if you don't know what destitution means, basically really, really freaking poor. Honora's other sister, Nellie Kelly, was never sent to the asylum but was later institutionalized for, though it is unknown where or why she was institutionalized. Honora thought that she would have a family with Anne Toppan. However, Anne Toppan despised Honora's Irish and Catholic beliefs. Anne Toppan would verbally and physically humiliate Honora for her Irish heritage and also her weight, as she was chubby for a young girl her age. Anne Toppan changed Honora Kelly's name to Jane Toppan and also changed her background to the daughter of an Italian immigrant that died at sea. Jane tried to please her foster mother but got no love or affection. She was constantly shamed by Anne, mocking her low status, and also said that no one would like her because her weight made her ugly. On the other hand, Jane's foster sister Elizabeth was adored by Anne Toppan. She rarely did housework, and as much or as hard as Jane did, Elizabeth constantly received gifts. She also received compliments on being pretty. Anne Toppan even formally adopted Elizabeth as her daughter. However, she never did this with Jane. However, Elizabeth was very kind to Jane and introduced her foster sister to new friends and looked out for Jane the best she could. Both girls attended school. For Elizabeth, school and socializing came easy to her, but for Jane, she had difficulty with school and socializing. She acted out by being very outspoken to make up for this difficulty socializing in school by telling grandiose stories and lies about her heritage, such as her father being a sailor, or that Jane's real sister was actually married to a wealthy prince. If anyone called Jane out on her lies, Jane would secretly gossip and spread rumors about them, and told lies to get other students in trouble, often blaming her own misdeeds on others and telling on students as often as she could, so essentially tattletaling. Jane also stole from the school and her classmates. As Jane grew into her teenage years, she continued to lie with even more outlandish stories and steal despite becoming popular for her bubbly personality. Jane tried dating, but boys avoided her for her reputation of lying and her weight, while Elizabeth fell in love with a local deacon at the local church named Ormel Brigham. The two were soon engaged and married, and by 1872 both girls graduated high school and their service to Anne Toppan ended with the payment of $50 as agreed upon. However, Anne Toppan died shortly afterwards and left everything to Elizabeth and her new husband, Ormel. Jane now had nowhere to go, and so Elizabeth hired Jane as a housekeeper for the first time. for the time being. In the 1880s, Jane claimed she found a husband who worked as a local office worker, but the office worker is reported to have left Jane at the altar and skipped town to marry another woman. After supposedly being left at the altar, Jane contemplated suicide several times, but she eventually gave up on it. However, this supposed being left at the altar by an office worker could have also been another one of Jane's stories and an example of her lying. But again, because of the time period, we really just don't know. In 1885, Jane, now 31 years old, decided to leave Elizabeth's house and pursue becoming a nurse, believing she had no other alternatives if no one would marry her. Elizabeth assured Jane that she would always be welcome in the Brigham household if she ever needed a place to stay. In 1887, Jane, now 33 years old, traveled to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and enrolled into Boston's Cambridge Hospital and began training as a nurse. Jane would kiss up to her professors and superiors and was loved by many of her patients, who gave her the nickname Jolly Jane from her stocky build and sunny personality. Jane also lied frequently. She gossiped about her colleagues and tattled on any fellow nurses who broke the rules or made mistakes, while blaming others for her own mistakes, and she also continued to steal from the hospital. One day, Jane and the fellow nurses were called in to take notes on an autopsy. As the doctor proceeded to cut the cadaver open and show the contents of the room, Jane became increasingly fascinated while others were repulsed. Jane became obsessed with the process of death and decay. She wanted to learn more, attending any autopsy she could and vigorously taking notes. She also would ask questions to learn anything she could during these autopsies. Of course, Jane's supervisors just considered her attitude towards death a quirk, and after discovering her interest in death, Jane began to experiment with drugs and her patients. While Jane was being praised for her bedside manner and even wanted to stay longer, her patients wanted to stay longer in order to be around Jane, and even requested Jane as her primary nurse. She would actually falsify charts and medical papers, such as writing incorrect information and changing patients' release dates to make them stay longer. This is the Cambridge Hospital, where Jane would be trained at around this time. Jane used her favorite patients as test subjects, including men, women, and the old and the weak. She would select specific patients that she liked and would give them varying amounts of medicine to test the effects over the next 4 years. Jane would give extra morphine or add a little strychnine, but Jane mainly preferred atropine and morphine. Atropine is used in pesticides, and nerve agents, and is used in small amounts in medicine as a way to speed up the heart rate in the instances where the heart is about to stop. It is also used to increase saliva production for whatever reason, and inhibits the parasympathetic nervous system which controls hunger, arousal, urination, defecation, etc. So it's used basically as a sort of sedative almost. In high doses, atropine is highly poisonous, causing blurry vision, loss of balance, discomfort to light, also known as photophobia, hallucinations, excitement, and eventually death. Jane would induce a coma with morphine and then wake them up with atropine, and back to a coma with morphine for hours or even days, possibly weeks on end of this procedure. Although from lack of records and accounts, it is unclear how many people Jane experimented on or even killed while doing this experimentation, although she later claimed to have killed dozens of patients. So most likely she's already committed her first kill and is probably already a serial killer. Jane would also get into her victims' beds and snuggle with them as they died, often fondling them, and held her victims intimately as they finally died from one last lethal dose of atropine. Here are some syringes that are commonly used in medicine during the time Jane Toppan was active and was a nurse. And here is a morphine kit that is also would have been used around the time Jane Toppan was active. Amelia Finney was a 30-year-old woman and had just gotten out of surgery when Jane administered a bitter-tasting medicine, saying it would help with the after effects of the surgery. Amelia Finney then began to slip into unconsciousness and believed she saw Jane climb into the bed and kiss her repeatedly on the head and face. A staff member came into the room and spooked Jane, and she ran away. Amelia Finney was released from the hospital the next day, unsure if what she saw was a dream or just effects from the drugs or if it was actually real. So that was one of the few records we have of her experimentation, and possibly a victim that survived from Jane. Despite Jane killing possibly dozens of patients at Cambridge Hospital, Jane was never caught or even suspected by staff or Jane's superiors. And over the 4 years after attending at the hospital and even being praised for taking care of patients who made it and then gaining sympathy over patients who died under her care. However, Jane's high death rate among her patients caused concern, and Jane was recommended to receive better training at the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, which was the largest medical learning institution in Massachusetts at the time, and one of the first places to use ether as an anesthetic in surgery. Jane, now 36 years old, headed to Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston and continued to experiment and kill helpless patients, especially the ones who trusted her the most. And she also selected ones that Jane's liked, often not going ones she was unfamiliar or uncomfortable with. It is unclear how many patients died under Jane's care at Massachusetts General Hospital as well, again from the lack of records. But Jane also did continue to lie and steal at Massachusetts General Hospital, which is pictured here. By the summer of 1890, Jane was a rising star at the hospital that she was now training in, and was in head of the nursing staff when the head nurse was unavailable. However, a rule at the Massachusetts General Hospital is to never leave the premises without permission in order to assure that in an emergency all staff are present to help. Feeling cocky, Jane left the grounds of the hospital one day thinking no one would find out, but Jane made a few enemies from her lying and her stealing and also spreading rumors about people and her tattletailing, and was quickly told on, and Jane was dismissed from the hospital. This was a very big blow to Jane and her ego, as she had just passed her final test and was about to graduate and get her diploma signed and received a nursing license. Of course, Jane was furious. And so in the fall of 1890, Jane returned to Cambridge Hospital and convinced the committee there to have her take the final test again and get a nursing license. Jane passed and received her license and stayed at Cambridge Hospital to work as a nurse. However, she didn't stay long, as many of the other nurses knew about Jane's habits of lying and stealing, and Jane was eventually dismissed from Cambridge Hospital in early 1891 for reckless administering of opioids. Of course, the background on opioids, they are pharmaceutical drugs made from opium and are used to numb pain or put patients under. So we can also see that she's probably experimenting this time with opioids instead of atropine and morphine. Jane would later administer opioids to study the effect on patients and further experiment. By the summer of 1891, after being dismissed at Cambridge Hospital, Jane decided to become a private nurse and act as a freelance caregiver to private homes and hospitals if needed, kind of like a call-in nurse or substitute. I can't remember what it's called, but when a temporary nurse. Her superiors at Cambridge Hospital gave Jane glowing recommendations despite her lying, stealing, and being dismissed by two hospitals. One of them, in fact, twice. Jane quickly became one of the most successful private nurses in Massachusetts, and at only 38 years old, Jane was making $20 a week, when the average for a working woman's wage was only $5 a week. Jane continued to steal and lie about her past she would steal from her patients and lie about her past with extravagant and intricate stories. Although her employers found this annoying, they simply wrote it off as a poor Irish upbringing. Can kind of still see that prejudice still kind of taking effect. With Jane being so successful, she spent much of her time drinking beer, making new friends, and she would turn her friends against each other again by spreading rumors and gossip, etc. After about 3 years after Jane's dismissal from Cambridge and her last murder. Wait, what last murder? We didn't cover a murder. Because again, records are, so we don't know her murders at this time period. Jane was enjoying her success and job as a private nurse. Then, in May of 1895, Jane decided to murder her landlord, Israel Dunham, and poisoned him over time by spiking his tea with various drugs, most likely, again, morphine and atropine. Once Israel Dunn became sick enough, Jane would take care of him as a private nurse, giving him morphine and atropine and to slip in and out of a coma until finally killing Israel Dunham on May 26, 1895. Israel Dunham was 83 years old. Israel Dunham's wife, Lovely Dunham, was devastated about her husband's death, and so Jane said that she would stay around to comfort Lovely in her difficult time. Jane and Lovely Dunham grew to become close friends over the next few years. However, Jane decided to poison Lovely Dunham, and she died on September 19th, 1897, at the age of 87. 1897 at the age of 87. Then, Jane had been visiting her foster sister, Elizabeth Brigham, as she is now known, with her husband Ormel, and her husband Ormel Brigham, who were happy to have Jane visit. In August 1899, Elizabeth was vacationing at Buzzards Bay, Massachusetts, when she complained to Jane about experiencing depression and wanted Jane's medical advice. Jane suggested that the two should meet at Jane's new vacation home in Cape Cod, and they spent the next few days catching up with each other. Of course, we know the vacation home in Cape Cod was easily affordable for her high salary at the time period. Then one day, Jane took Elizabeth on a picnic and fed Elizabeth corned beef, taffy, and mineral water. All were laced with strychnine. Strychnine is a highly toxic chemical that is used in pesticides of small rodents and birds. It causes muscular convulsions and asphyxia. Also used in the 1800s as a performance enhancer in small doses for athletes. Of course, this practice has stopped for obvious reasons. Elizabeth soon became sick, and Jane took care of her as her own personal caretaker over the next few days. And Jane would use her traditional MO of morphine and atropine to slowly poison Elizabeth Brigham, and she finally died on August 29th, 1899, at the age of 70. Jane later described Elizabeth's final moments as, quote, "I held her in my arms and watched with delight as she gasped for life." In fall of 1899, Elizabeth Brigham was buried by Ormel Brigham with Jane's help. Jane told Ormel that Elizabeth's last wishes were for Jane to have a gold watch and chain, and so without much questioning, Ormel gave Jane the watch and chain, which she soon pawned off afterwards. Jane also tried to seduce Ormel and imitate Elizabeth's lifestyle, but Ormel rejected her. Jane didn't kill again until December 29th, 1899, and killed her patient, Mary McNear, who was 70 years old. The murder of Mary McNear was very quick compared to Jane's other victims. And unlike Jane's other victims, Jane didn't know Mary McNear very well. If you remember, she prefers to select victims that she knows or is comfortable with, not very much of strangers. Then Jane killed Florence Calkins on January 15th, 1900, who was 25 years old and Elizabeth's housekeeper. Jane then killed her patient, William Ingerman, who died on January 27th, 1900, at the age of 70. Jane next killed her friend Sarah, or Myra as she was known, Connors, who worked at the technical school in Cambridge as a dining matron, who is a woman in charge of domestic and medical arrangements at a boarding school or establishment, in this case, dining halls. The job came with an apartment. So, Myra Connors fell ill, and Jane was asked to take care of her. Jane killed her on February 11th, 1900, at the age of 48. After Myra Connors died, Jane told Myra's superiors at the technical or theoretical school that Myra had been training Jane to take the position of dining matron. The school accepted Jane as the new dining matron because, well, their latest one kind of died, and so they really needed to get one filled in pronto. So they were like, well, all right. The school and Jane gained the apartment. Plus, being a dining matron was a perfect way to find victims. However, by November 1900, Jane was dismissed from the school after receiving numerous complaints from coworkers about Jane's incompetence of lying and was found to be stealing from the school. She claimed no known victims during her time there. After being dismissed from the school, Jane had a difficult time finding work and needed a new place to live after losing the apartment the school provided. In early 1901, Jane found residence with Melvin and Eliza Beadle, who let her stay with them after nursing them from gastrointestinal illness, most likely caused by Jane's poisoning of them to fall into good favor with the Beadles. Jane also became the new housekeeper after the old housekeeper, Mary Sullivan, was found drunk on the job and was fired. Jane also poisoned Mary Sullivan to make her appear to be drunk and again to become in good graces with the Beadles. Jane didn't kill the Beadles or Mary Sullivan, but once Jane made enough money working at the Beadles, she moved out and rented a small cottage from Alden and Mattie Davis, and received a discount for being a nurse. After some time, the Davis became frustrated with Jane as she would not pay rent, and Mattie Davis went to the cottage in order to collect. Jane told Mattie that she would pay rent and offered her some tea that was laced with morphine. Over the next 7 days, Jane held Mattie Davis helpless, and in order to avoid suspicion, she wrote to Alden Davis that Mattie was just ill and she was taking care of her. Over the next 7 days, Jane toyed with Mattie Davis before going back into a coma until she finally died on July 5th, 1901, at the age of 62. As you can notice, also her victims are also very elderly and are weak, frail, etc. At the funeral, Jane offered her apologies for not being able to save Mattie and offered to stay with Alden Davis while he was grief-stricken. Jane immediately moved in and decided to kill the entire Davis family, at first by trying to burn down the house and set 3 small fires, but the fires were quickly discovered and put out. However, the Davis family did not suspect Jane of trying to commit arson. Frustrated that arson wasn't working, Jane returned to her traditional MO of poisoning and first decided to poison Alden Davis's youngest daughter, Genevieve Gordon, or Annie. Genevieve or Annie Gordon. She was originally Genevieve or Annie Davis, but she was married at the time. So just kind of to clarify, Annie Gordon was a full adult, even though the youngest daughter. She was staying with her father after the funeral of Mattie Davis, and Jane killed Genevieve Annie Gordon, on July 26, 1901. Jane said that Genevieve's death was a suicide as she had stolen medical supplies from Jane and administered them herself. However, I'm pretty sure we can conclude that this is a lie. This is the cottage that she was renting from the Davis family. Jane then killed Alden Davis on August 8, 1901, at the age of 64, and 4 days later killed the last member of the Davis family, Mary or Minnie Gibbs, on August 12, 1901, at the age of 40, by using morphine tablets laced in Minnie's drink. Jane not only cuddled with Minnie this time, but while she died, she also forced Minnie's 10-year-old son to cuddle with his dying mother. With the Davis family dead, Minnie Gibbs' father-in-law, Paul Gibbs, dismissed Jane as Jane was also trying to seduce Minnie Gibbs' husband's now widower. Whose name I do not know. Shortly after killing the Davis family, Jane returned to her hometown of Lowell, Massachusetts, hoping to seduce Ormel Brigham, Elizabeth's late husband. Well, Elizabeth's widower. Jane moved in with Ormel Brigham and his sister Edna Bannister, the housekeeper and Ormel's sister. Jane saw Edna Bannister as a rival for Ormel's affection and quickly poisoned her, and she died on August 26, 1901. Jane also started to poison Ormel, but not to kill him, but to nurse him back to health in order to gain his affection. However, once Ormel recovered, he rejected Jane's advances, and so, enraged, Jane threatened to spread rumors that she was pregnant with Ormel's child. After this incident, Ormel decided to throw Jane out, but Jane was terrified at the idea of being homeless and attempted suicide by overdose on morphine. As soon as Jane recovered, though, obviously she failed by attempted, she was kicked out of the Brigham household for good. This are the tombstones of the Davis family, Alden Davis and Mary. Here is Genevieve Davis Gordon. Then again, another sketch of the houses where Jane Toppan worked, the cottage and the household. The Davis house, or what became the Gibbs house after all the Davis family died. Paul Gibbs ordered that the bodies of his dead relatives be exhumed and performed an autopsy and toxicity report by the famous Dr. Leonard Wood, who, in order to follow suspicions of the entire family dying in just a month. The test and autopsy confirmed that the Davis family members all died from poisoning, and Paul Gibbs looked to Jane Toppan as a likely suspect, whom he noticed was working for the Davis family during all of the deaths. Paul Gibbs notified the police, and the Massachusetts police assigned Detective John S. Patterson to investigate and track Jane Toppan down. Jane moved in with her old friend, Sarah Nichols, but Patterson quickly tracked down Jane and arrested her for the murder of the Davis family on October 29th, 1901, at the age of 47 years old. Jane was taken to Barnstable jailhouse to await trial. And 2 days later, Jane pled not guilty by reason of insanity, as recommended by Jane's lawyers. And the trial was scheduled for November 8th, 1901. Jane was interviewed by Boston psychiatrist Dr. Henry Steidman to determine Jane's mental state. Jane then confessed to killing 31 people and was suspected of killing more from her days of experimenting. As said, she killed for a sexual thrill. Most of her confession was over-exaggerated, however, and she had to be interviewed multiple times in order to determine what was actually correct. Often they did this by looking at consistencies and ruling out the inconsistencies in Jane's outrageous stories. As highlighted, because she was lying, she would often change her story so prosecutors no inconsistencies, la la da da. Prosecutors took time to create a case against Jane from her lengthy lies and confessions, and so Jane went under further evaluation, and her trial was delayed again to November 11th, 1901. Then again to December 11th, 1901. And again, March 31st, 1902. And then Jane's trial finally began on June 23rd, 1902. Only being officially charged with 4 counts of murder in the Davis family, Jane's trial only lasted 4 hours to present evidence in the case of the prosecutors. And Jane and the jury took 20 minutes to reach a verdict. Jane Toppan was found not guilty by reason of insanity. However, based on her behavior, she was most likely legally sane. However, appears that she certainly had some mental issues. During the trial, Jane said, quote, "That is my ambition, to have killed more people, helpless people, than any man or woman who has ever lived." So we have some lovely sketches of Jane Toppan at her time in her court. By this time, she did confess to 31 murders. However, she was only charged with the murders of the Davis family. Here's her being escorted to her cell. Little portrait of her. As you can see, where the nickname Jolly Jane came from, she's just smiling even though she's in court. Let's see. Strange Murder Mania of Jane Toppan, 20th century. Lucia Burgeon. I don't know how to pronounce that, and I don't really know that person, but I'm guessing a poisoner of some sort. Miss Jane Toppan as she appeared in court. Another portrait of Jane Toppan. Okay, so Jane was overcome with joy, thinking that she would only spend a few months in the asylum and released, and also believed that she had fooled everyone. However, Jane Toppan was sentenced to Toppan Insane Hospital for life. Jane's time at the hospital was difficult for her as she became paranoid, fearing that someone would poison her in an act of revenge. Jane also asked for drugs to poison herself and others. Many expected Jane Toppan to slowly waste away in the hospital, and she did. However, of course, newspapers went wild with the story of the nurse who killed people, and the public was confused on how someone seeming so nice and cheery as Jane showed no signs of being crazy and murdering people. Over the years, Jane grew less paranoid and calmed down, and she became quite quiet and old in her age. Jane was never offered parole, and she died of old age on August 17th, 1938, at 84 years old. She is recognized today as one of America's most prolific female serial killers. Over to her left above, we have her photo at her first year at the hospital, and then her second year. You can really see her aging. This is the hospital that Jane was committed to. Newspaper headlines: Jane Toppan thinks she murdered 84. So she claimed, but we've only really sufficiently connected possibly 32. But it could be high as that. It's very possible. Poison her passion. Jane Toppan confessed to killing 31 persons. A long list of persons done to death by trained nurse, alienist. There's that word again, if you remember from our Albert Fish episode what an alienist is. Puzzled over most remarkable case in history. Jane Toppan, spinster. Don't know why it says spinster. Aged 45, a trained nurse by profession, and by confession, a murderer of 31 persons, is now safely confined at the Asylum for the insane at Taunton, Massachusetts, to which place she was taken after the alienist appointed by the court had declared her of unsound mind and irresponsible for her conduct. Her crimes outrivaled those of Lucia Borgia. She stands singly and alone as the greatest criminal of modern times. Holmes, who was hanged, referring to H. Holmes, who was hanged at Philadelphia in 1895, was an amateur. I'm not sure. Garcia Palso, executed in the city of Mexico in 1867. Velarde, I think that's enough of that article. Women suspected of many murders, mysterious death and sickness in 3 families that harbored Miss Toppan. Here is a little caricature of Jane Toppan and her attorney James S. Murray of Laurel in her cell in Barnstable Jail. Go over the charge of murder against her, the house in which the 4 murder. Okay, that's not visible. Government's case against Miss Toppan based on patient's use of something water as. Jane Toppan, as she appeared in court yesterday when the jury was being impaneled with a big smile on her face. Miss Toppan will force the fight. Hopes to win in lower court. Tried twice to kill herself in Lowell a month ago. Jane Toppan sent to asylum for life. She confessed to poisoning Mrs. Gibbs, but jury found she was insane. Jane Toppan declared insane. Experts to so report the Attorney General. And here's some more photos of all the houses that she was in. Let's see, in the upper left-hand corner is the house 70 Wendell Street where Miss Toppan lived and where Israel Dunham and his wife, patients of Miss Toppan, died. The next to it is the refectory of St. John's School, Cambridge, where Mrs. Connors died. In the lower left-hand corner is the Davis home at Catrama, I don't know, and next to it is the Brigham home in Lowell. So let's go over it. This is the house of her landlord, Israel and Lovely Dunham. This, I believe, is the theoretical school and the apartment where her friend Sarah or Myra Connors worked at. This is, of course, again, the cabin or the Davis home. And this is the Brigham home with Elizabeth and Orville Brigham lived. Her charismatic smile. No matter how deep her troubles, Miss Toppan has preserved a calm and cheerful exterior to friends and foe alike as she turned a smiling, tracing career of Miss Toppan. another photo of, this is a photo of Elizabeth again, and this is Ormel Brigham, Elizabeth's husband. Medicine found in the house may be clue to murder. Wait. Well, man was loaned $1,600 to Miss Toppin, whom she wanted to marry and who believed she escaped death by terminating her services to him as a nurse. I have no idea what that's about. Jane's confession shows that as a prisoner, she reveled and has her dementia. Jane Toppin, with her mania and administering poison to the patients whom she nursed, has been ranked with the two most famous poisoners of history, Lucertia Borgia and Catherine de' Medici. De Medici. Jane Toppin, I believe this was when she was younger, though, but I'm not sure what that's about. Jane Toppin, slowly dying, is the victim of the something of her murderous work. The modern Borgia, haunted by the phantoms of her victims, is facing death. Let's be honest, she is not feeling she was not feeling guilty or haunted in any way. Or maybe some shame, most of it was probably from not wanting to be in the asylum for the rest of her life. Jane Toppin as she was 4 years age, and then Jane Toppin as she is today on 1906. Miss Toppin, 84, mass poisoner, dies. Jolly Jane, prisoner, dies. When anyone says killed at least 100, was held insane. If rumors of Peter... So, now we get into the psychological profile. If the rumors of Peter Kelly are true about the attempt to sew his eyes closed, and the fact that Jane's sister was institutionalized may show a sign of mental instability in the family, making Jane at a possible biological predisposition for mental illness, although not necessarily murder, but mostly mental illness that led to murder, in a sense. Jane living in destitution and no positive role model to teach Jane right versus wrong could have affected Jane's mental development, already struggling with destitution and abuse from her drunk father. Jane had further issues and would eat large amounts of food at the asylum, which gave her weight and then contributed to low self-esteem, especially when Aunt Toppin began to mock her. And when Jane was sent to Aunt Toppin and she was ridiculed by her Irish background, and her life so far meant nothing, she had low self-esteem and was especially devastating and this low self-esteem was especially devastating for a child. Aunt Toppin verbally abusing Jane and Jane having to change her entire background caused an identity crisis in Jane's early development of identity. This made Jane try anything to please others and lash out when frustrated, confused, and or angry. Jane also started to believe everything was her fault and that she was a bad person by nature. So it's likely that Jane Toppin had borderline personality disorder with all of these characteristics. Jane also started to believe that everything was, when Anne Toppin mocked Jane's low status and weight, making her think she was ugly, Jane would eat more, adding to the problem, further deteriorating that self-esteem. Jane developed an inferiority complex and grew to hate herself and her status in life. Meanwhile, as Elizabeth got love and affection from Aunt Toppin, Jane developed resentment towards Elizabeth for the fact no matter what Elizabeth did, her life was much easier and everything came naturally to her, even though they both had the same background, which only grew when Jane saw how popular Elizabeth was in school. In school, to compensate for her poor communication, Jane would be outspoken and lash out by lying and stealing. Jane was also seeking attention and positive reinforcement, but didn't know how to achieve it any other way but to lie and steal. It is likely that Jane had conduct disorder, and which is, of course, the behavior exhibited with lying, stealing, blah, 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 blah. And as Jane entered her teen years, she felt more rejected as boys wouldn't date her for her and her weight and lying. And Jane further hated Elizabeth when she got her husband Ormond Brigham. So it's also possible that it seems to be quite clear that she is what's the word? Crap, it slipped my mind. Pathological liar. It is also possible that she might have a Munchausen syndrome by proxy, or what is now known as fictitious disorder, where she's making out all these outlandish stories to kind of like garner sympathy and to kind of like help with her self-image as a sort of coping mechanism. So it's very possible that would also make sense with her how she enjoyed getting praise from her superiors and also sympathies from having when her patient died also, because that is very common in terms of nurse killers. They often do have Munchausen syndrome and look for sympathy or attention when their victims die. That is also similar to the way how she poisoned some people and only nursed them back to health instead of actually killing them in order to garner attention and sympathy. And however, that also could be in line with just profit, because with the gaining the position as dining matron at the school, she got an apartment, and because she was so desperate to not live in poverty and destitution, probably because of her trauma experience from living destitution. So she was desperate to avoid that lifestyle and would kill for that. So we have profit motivation, possible attention motivation so far. We're going to get into the real deeply twisted stuff. Let's see. When Anne Toppan died and Elizabeth inherited everything, Jane's resentment especially grew, along with working for Elizabeth as the housekeeper. Even though, as an act of kindness by Elizabeth, since Jane had nowhere to go or live, Jane saw this as insulting, and not only did Elizabeth receive all of the affection, but also got the inheritance, and now Jane had to work for her like she had worked for Anne Toppan. Elizabeth had everything Jane had ever wanted, causing this deep resentment, and also did help with her borderline personality disorder and poor self-image. When when Jane was supposedly left at the altar from a potential husband, she later claimed it may have stopped her from killing, quote, "If I had married, I probably would not have killed all those people. I would have my husband, my children, and my home to take up my mind." So that kind of supports the thing how Elizabeth had everything that Jane wanted. Of course, since Jane had a habit of lying, this could just be a story for Jane to tell people and to her and to like make people garner sympathy. She did have a fictitious disorder or yada yada yada, or as a way to rationalize or excuse her crimes. But this could just be a story to tell people, and to her, her seemed like she had the life she wanted, or it was a way to cover up the true reasons for her killing. During her residence at the Cambridge Hospital, Jane became obsessed with death and developed what is known as erotophonophilia, or a sexual attraction to death as a part of a control fantasy, which further developed into paraphilic disorder as she began experimenting with her patients. So far, we have so with her borderline person, so with her wait, hold on, let me back up. With her fear of destitution and avoiding that, and we have a profit motive. Then with her low self-esteem and possible fictitious disorder, we have attention and Also, because she feels like she has no control over her life, we have control motive. And now, with her developing neurophonophilia, we have sexual motive. So, there's really a lot of angles of Jane Toppan and her motives of killing. So let's dig more into the control aspect of her motive. Jane had no power in childhood from Anne Toppan mocking her, plus living in destitution, but in death, all the ridicule and cruel gestures stopped, and Jane had the power to control a person's life, which was sexually intoxicating to her. Jane killed to gain sexual pleasure and control, which she desperately wanted all her life. What makes Jane Toppan unusual, however, is that she kills for sexual pleasure, similar what to most male serial killers do. And most female serial killers do not kill for sexual reasons, but she did kill in a common way to female serial killers by selecting patients she liked or felt more comfortable and familiar with, not going in uncharted waters. But then again, that's actually very common with most serial killers, even male serial killers. Most male serial killers will have like a specific target or an area in which they select victims that's very comfortable to them because they don't like uncharted waters. So that's not that different. But in female serial killer cases, when selecting specific patients, they like have a personal connection more than male serial killers seem to do. Also, a part of her sexual control fantasy, and by using drugs to be discreet like a female serial killer. Jane's cycle of torture with morphine and atropine comas was a control and, in many cases, a sadistic aspect. So we also have some sadism in the mix. But most sadists often like the control they get because they have all the power when torturing, and that's some of this. Because control and sadism really kind of goes hand in hand unless we're talking with necrophilia, in which case they're controlling and avoiding rejection. But we've already talked about necrophilia with Ed Kemper and all that kind of stuff. When Jane became a private nurse, she had control of her life and she stopped killing for a while. But now that one of her motives is satisfied, she wanted the sexual gratification of death. Sorry about that. And so we're really kind of seeing she's getting a taste for the killing itself, not for what it gives her, but just because of sexual gratification. And resumed killing, yet control still played a role in her killing and her fantasies, as she loved to manipulate people, thinking it was just a big game. As we can see, manipulating her friends, still controlling people, spreading rumors, all that stuff, lying. She likes that control. When Jane killed her foster sister Elizabeth, it was out of revenge and hatred, similar to female killers, and wanted her life with a family with love and affection that ties to Jane's identity crisis from childhood and low sense of self. So she tried to take Elizabeth's life and her lifestyle by attempting to seduce Elizabeth's husband Ormel and claim her life. Jane wasn't happy with her life and she believed that her life was useless. But Elizabeth's life was perfect, and Jane wanted it as her own as a way to escape her own life. And however, when Jane killed Mary McClear, it was unusual for her to kill her quickly and was probably just for sexual gratification, and also kind of like how we discussed murders become addicted to that emotional high of killing. Maybe she just was coming out of her cooling off period and just needed some sort of release and to get that emotional high. And instead of doing her usual thing of killing them slowly and killing people she knew. Jane killing her friend Myra Connors to gain her persona as the dining matron at the theological school shows the more female motives to gain a better position in life, so profit motives. When Jane killed Minnie Gibbs and forced her 10-year-old son to cuddle with her as she died, possibly out of revenge, possibly out of control and sadism. But earlier, Jane asked Minnie if all her debts to the family would be cleared, but Minnie refused, and so Jane got revenge by having her son cuddle with her as she died, also controlling the son and being sadistic and la da 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 da. When Jane was held not guilty and declared insane, she thought she tricked everyone and felt more in control. However, despite Jane's efforts, she was never able to find the positivity she desperately wanted through all of her issues, trying to get profit and higher position to avoid destitution, the lying and the fictitious disorder in order to get sympathy, killing Elizabeth to gain a better position in life, sexual gratification, gaining control to help her poor self-esteem, but none of it really went away. Tormented by bigotry and ridicule plus poor self-esteem, Jane never knew the feeling of love and turned her pain to others by gaining pleasure, watching others die, and comfort in the absence of cruelty and feelings of pain and anger and death. Jane holding her victims in their final moments was about power, control, and a bit of revenge over a life she felt never got a fair shot, along with sexual pleasure and profit. All right, that concludes Jane Toppan. Join me next time when we begin the biography on Nanny Doss, who had a victim count of confessed to 8 but is believed to have killed 11. Thank you. I am Porter Hymas. Please like and subscribe. I hope you enjoyed the video on Jane Toppan. Please leave comments about any requests for biographies. I am looking for material for Volume 4. I am Porter Hymas. I've been your narrator. Thank you and goodbye.